Hello and welcome. 6 years of roadblocks and entrenched positions is how many critics of the World Trade Organization see the Doha round of talks. Since those first meetings in 2001, agricultural subsidies and trade tariffs have largely been the sticking point holding back an agreement. Is there any hope of movement? The head of the WTO optimistically believes so and says 2008 is a crucial year and one in which a final agreement could be signed. But what of the serious divisions that many say still remain? We'll examine that as we speak on this show with the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy. Glad you could join us. And I have to ask you, the news coming from your office is basically this year is a crucial year for the Doha round. Why do you see it specifically as crucial?
Well, for a variety of reasons. First, this negotiation has been going on for 6 years now, and year 7 is the right moment, given the level of maturity, of ripeness of this negotiation. Of course, it's a very complex negotiation, but we've accumulated quite a lot of material on the table, and people can now see the end. The second reason is more political. The resolve of the big main players to get a deal this year, US, Europe, Brazil, India, China, Indonesia, is there. And we've had sort of recent signals from the US administration that the president wants that before the next administration. And last reason, the more the financial world creates turbulences, the more we, modest trade people, have to create stability. So all in all, I think the environment is more conducive to a conclusion than it was last year. We've accumulated material, negotiations have progressed. Now, that doesn't mean I'm 100% sure it's going to be done. It remains a negotiation. And the World Trade Organization is a very big organization, and we have to agree on 20 topics and among 152 members who all have to give their agreement. But it's looking better and I believe now doable.
Now, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned there, the US administration wanting something to happen before the next government comes in. Of course, there's been a lot of posturing by the Bush administration prior to his departure. He wants to build legacies, obviously. Does that mean that the US is in a slightly weaker position because they'd like to achieve something? Or is it still going to be the kind of foot-dragging situation that has occurred for 6 years?
Well, I believe that strategically, the US need a stable trading environment, given the huge respiration of their economy with the rest of the world. They are a relatively open market, they are a competitive economy, so their interest is to open markets elsewhere. Now, of course, the others will not accept that without the US reducing their trade-distorting agricultural subsidies, which we all know is a difficult domestic issues, because when farmers are accustomed to subsidies, reducing them is a sort of, disaddiction, which is politically painful. But I think strategically, the track of the US administration makes it good for them that trade is more open and there are rules in the system which bind people together.
Is there any impact on what the WTO wants to achieve because of the more recent roller coaster ride the financial markets have been taking globally? Would that have any impact?
It may. Depending on how much of this financial cracks will fuel into the real economy, my economy, the one of traders who trade real things, it might have consequences. It's clear that any sort of reduction of a growth rate, any sort of shrinking of opportunities here and there has a consequence of emulating sort of protectionist surges. So this is dangerous. It's not there yet. We've got a bit of rhetoric. We don't have sort of facts that would sort of assess this, but there is a risk. And we have to hedge this risk And the best way of hedging this risk is sort of, repaying a bit for this big collective insurance policy against protectionism which we have, which is the World Trade Organization.
You were saying that the time is right for something to happen, and you mentioned the US and the EU has been pushing for something before the end of the year. And yet in the media there's always the term serious divisions appearing. And I wonder to what extent those serious divisions are of concern to you and how serious they are.
Negotiators are very clever. If I negotiate with you a deal, and I don't say the problem I have is very serious, you're not going to give me what I want you to give me. So there's a lot of posturing around this. Now, let's look at numbers. Not positions, not speeches, not posturing, numbers. What's on the table today for reducing agricultural subsidies? Minus 70 to 80%. Now, is it going to be 70? Is it going to be 80? Is it going to be 75, which is the midway? I don't know. But the difficulty now is between 70 and 80, whereas we started between 0 and something.
Your critics say that there's the danger you may take these talks into smaller sessions, excluding some of the nations, excluding some of the players in these so-called green room negotiations, and that sometimes the smaller nations have the biggest issues and their voice may not be heard. What danger is that?
I'll make sure the necessary transparency is there. We sometimes need to draft a group smaller than the 152 members plus 3 experts each, which is a big crowd. Now, I'll make sure that whichever smaller session, and we will need that, is composed in a way that all stakeholders are represented around the table.
Equally, I mean, to the same fair voice.
To the same level of course, US, EU, Japan will be there, but representatives of the G20, of the G33, of the African group, of the ACP group, of the ASEAN group, of the Latin American group will be there. And these smaller sort of caucuses, which we sometimes need, do not decide. They try and cook an agreement which then has to be validated by the whole membership.
Of course, you have the US and the EU coming to you. The talks are very prominent usually because they're very much publicized. In terms of the smaller nations, the developing nations, what are they telling you about their specific concerns, what they would like to see addressed, if anything is to go forward this year?
Well, I mean, we basically have, let's say, EU, US, Japan, emerging countries, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, Egypt, Indonesia, who are now sort of much more within the game of international economy. And then we have least developed countries, many of which in Africa. Now, what's clear is that the richest have to pay the most, the poorest have basically very marginal contribution, and emerging countries now, who used to be among the poorest, have a bit more to pay. Now, their concerns are mostly on agriculture, which is why agriculture has become the #1 feature in this round. Not that it's the larger part of world trade, but because for political reasons, developing countries have made it a point that they want this to be addressed. They believe that the previous rules on agricultural trade, tariff subsidies, were unfair because they were inherited from a world where EU, US, Japan were dominating. This has changed. The geopolitics of the WTO have tremendously changed in 10 or 15 years. Look at China, look at Brazil, look at India. So that's their round. They wanted it to be a development round. And my sense is that we will get no deal if developing countries who are sort of 70% of the membership of WTO don't accept it. And by the way, what's already on the table goes in this direction.
Let me put an email question to you, sir. We've got a couple of these. Of course, the WTO gets all kinds of things thrown at it. This email from Frank Smith in Nebraska in the US says, I think the WTO is just another tool of corporate globalizations. What difference do you make for the everyday person trying to make their way? How do you counter those sort of perceptions?
Well, I mean, these perceptions are there. The answer to that is, A, WTO is not where corporations deal, it's where governments deal. The members of the WTO are sovereign nation states who agree by consensus. So it's a government-driven negotiation.
Although many governments are lobbied heavily by...
Okay, but they're lobbied heavily by corporates, by civil society, by farmers, by consumers. So, I mean, up to each of the sovereign nation states who are members to cook its own system of preferences. Second, the difference in everybody's life is very simple. If you buy food or shirts or socks or cars at a cheaper price because they're done more efficiently elsewhere, you benefit from that as a consumer. Of course, this impacts production systems, economic and social fabrics, but at the end of the day, the law and history has shown that, and recent development in the international economy for the last 20 years have shown that. It creates more winners than losers, provided you look at the overall picture. Now, how does this translate into domestic issues? True, some people will have their life changed as producers if their industry, the services they're working, is impacted by international competition. And that's a matter for domestic polities to address, social safety nets, education, innovation. So you don't have the trade policy on one side and the education or the regional policy on the other side. It's a continuum which members of WTO have to address domestically.
I have an email question that came in from Abdullah in Michigan in the US. And he says, when will Yemen be allowed to join the WTO and what's the holdup?
Yemen is one of the 30 members who are 30 countries who are presently negotiating their accession. Now, acceding to WTO is a fairly complex process because you've got to negotiate the opening of your economy with already existing members, and you also have to sort of accept the radiography of your legislative and regulatory system to see whether it matches the sort of standard of a normally working market economy. So it takes time. Now, in the case of Yemen, which is a least developed country, it's moving. It's moving to the rhythm that Yemen itself has injected into the modernization, the transformation of its economy. We are giving a lot of technical assistance to Yemen. I'm sort of discussing that with them regularly. And the good thing in the region is that many other Arab countries in the region are sort of shouldering Yemen to this, including, for instance, the Islamic Development Bank, with whom we now have a very good working relationship on things like these sort of accession.
I was going to ask you how you see the Middle East region, especially the Gulf region where there's been such a boom, how that is shaping up when it comes to becoming a part of the whole world and WTO community.
If I look at the sort of 10 or 15 years time horizon, there's been a very big change during the last decade in the region. And the very big change is that a number of these economies were sort of mostly energy producers. And I mean, energy is not that such a big topic in WTO because, you know, if trade in energy is something which happens anyhow. If you have energy and I don't have energy, we'll trade. So the big change is in the fact that a number of countries in the regions have started diversifying. There's a lot of diversification. There are now, for instance, in the Gulf Cooperation Council, there are now economies where oil and gas is sort of 30, 40% of the GNP, and of trade, whereas 60% of the GNP comes from elsewhere, notably services. So a number of countries take, for instance, the United Emirates, have penetrated world trade tremendously in the recent years, and as a consequence of that, their stake in what's happening in WTO has increased, which is why, for instance, I'm having a very sort of a permanent interaction with them. Of course, countries like Egypt, who've been part of the system for a long time. This is why we're helping, for instance, Lebanon to try and join the World Trade Organization, although they still have some domestic difficulties. So it's become much more vibrant as the region has entered into industry and services.
Let me return as we wrap up the interview towards the front end of the conversation where we talked about legacies being left with the US and so on and change of administration there. When you hear some of the anti-WTO and anti-NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement rhetoric in the presidential campaigning, how does it strike you? Does it strike you as a potentially serious problem, or is it just posturing?
No, it's, I mean, it's a serious problem. If public opinion believes that trade opening is not good, it's a serious problem. My answer is A, look at history, look at numbers, look at the level of salaries in the US part of the economy that exports. It's 20% over the average US salary. Look at the benefits for the consumers. So this case we have to argue because, being protected is a normal thing in human nature. When people have a problem, they ask for protection. And I think there is a bit of that in the US system. There is a bit of that in Europe. There is a bit of that in China, in India. We just have to make our case more convincingly and make sure that the real problems in terms of job dislocation, outsourcing, which trade diversification and trade opening creates, are addressed by domestic policies. Now, the US can do that on their own. The Europeans can do that on their own. If it is Senegal or Kenya or Cambodia or Uruguay, they need some assistance to do that, which is why I have been pushing this sort of aid for trade agenda on top of what we do in WTO in order to increase the capacity of these countries to trade.
Well, Pascal Lamy, many more questions, but we're out of time. I thank you very much for speaking with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for joining us. Don't forget, if you have any suggestions for the show, send us an email to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is coming up next.